Hey guys, and welcome back to the podcast. So today I want to talk about the conversion from Saul to Paul. This is one of those very complex stories in the Bible because even in this short video I'm doing, I really can't cover all of it. So there will be a longer video later covering even more of it. But it's still worth talking about, so I hope you enjoy it. So some questions I'm going to ask is, who was Saul? Why would he persecute Christians? And what could have been his possible motives for doing so? So let's begin by taking a look at Acts chapter 9, starting in verse 1 and going through about verse 6, where we see the conversion from, he's still called Saul, because technically Paul is a Roman variant of the name Saul. So let's just talk about his conversion. Meanwhile, Saul was still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. He went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues in Damascus, so that if he found any there who belonged to the way, whether men or women, he might take them as prisoners to Jerusalem. As he neared Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice say to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" "Who are you, Lord?" Saul asked. "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting," he replied. "Now get up and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do." So that covers his pretty radical conversion, which that doesn't complete it, but that's the beginning of it. So then I thought it might behoove us to go back and talk about who Saul was before this. So Saul of Tarsus was born in approximately 5 AD in the city of Tarsus in modern-day Turkey. He was born to Jewish parents who possessed Roman citizenship, a coveted privilege that their own son would also possess. And we'll get a little bit into more of that later. In about 10 AD, Saul's family moved to Jerusalem. Sometime between 15 and 20 AD, Saul began his studies of the Hebrew Scriptures in the city of Jerusalem under Rabbi Gamaliel. It was under Gamaliel that Saul would begin an in-depth study of the law with the famous rabbi. It's quite possible, actually more than quite possible, that Saul was present for the trial of Stephen, a trial that resulted in Stephen becoming the first Christian martyr. And you can find that story in Acts chapter 7, verses 54 to 60. The historian Luke tells us, now this is why I say more than highly possible, Luke was a disciple of Paul. So Luke telling us about this makes it more than highly possible that Saul was there. That Stephen's executioners laid their garments at the feet of Saul, and that's in Acts 7, verse 58, who was in full approval of the mob's murderous actions. That's Acts chapter 8, verse 1. Saul later ravaged the church, entering the homes of believers and committing them to prison. Saul's anti-Christian zeal motivated him not only to arrest and imprison male Christians, the ringleaders, but to lock up female believers as well. And this is from Acts 8:3. So, this is the text and a little bit of context from the Bible that we have surrounding Saul. What this doesn't fully explain is the intentions of Saul. So here's what I can speculate of the situation. I think this needs a little bit more context because, as we see, it says Saul's anti-Christian zeal motivated him to not only arrest and imprison male Christians, the ringleaders, but to lock up the female believers as well. Okay, so you might ask, Saul is technically a Jew, and even though he had, you might say, as it's been told to me, that he would have had no authority in other places, such as Damascus, where he was going. But you have to understand that this is not talking about Damascus. This is talking about Jerusalem. So the context here is that he could have locked these people up. He could have imprisoned them with authority from the Romans, considering he had a Roman citizenship, and given the fact that the governor of Rome, Pilate, would not have been here at this time. We see Pilate in the Jesus story because he is there for the Passover festival. And the reason he's there is because at this time the city becomes overcrowded and it's much easier for riots to break out at this point in time. So Pilate's there to kind of help keep the order, but he wouldn't have been here at the time that Saul is doing these things. So we can see that being Jewish and having Roman citizenship was a coveted thing. Now this does play out later with his ability to have house arrest rather than being placed in prison. So the Roman citizenship is one possible motive for why he would have been persecuting the Christians. But I think the other more obvious one is this. Jesus commanded his disciples to disperse and preach the gospel. As Acts 1:8 tells us, "But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and all of Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth." Okay, so when we catch up with the disciples later, they're not doing this. They're hanging out in Jerusalem. How do we know that? Well, we get to the trial of the disciples where Gamaliel actually stands up for them and says, you should let these guys go. And his speech is moving enough that the compassion that is shown to them is that they're flogged and sent away and said with one specific command: do not talk about this Jesus guy anymore. Well, it's quite obvious what they do. They leave there and they're still preaching Jesus, but they're not going out of Jerusalem like they're instructed to do. So, you can see where Saul had his reasons for not liking the disciples, because he also says that he is a member of the Sanhedrin. So, seeing this, hearing what the Sanhedrin has to say to the disciples, like, don't go out and preach Jesus. Yet what do? They go out and they continue to preach Jesus. Saul has a problem with that. But I think God used Saul to persecute them purposely for disobeying the command to go out and be disciples everywhere. Now, once Saul takes care of this situation and they're dispersed, now what is he having to do? He's actually having to go out and look for people in other towns. On his way to Damascus, Jesus gives him a new mission. Says, no, this is what you've been doing, but, he blinds him, and then he sends of all people, somebody that Paul is on his way to persecute, which is Ananias, well, one of the people he would have been on his way to persecute. He sends Ananias to restore his sight, and then uses Paul for some of the greatest things that Christianity has taught us comes from Paul. Now, Paul says more than once that he had zeal for the law. Well, what does that mean? Okay, that means the pen stroke, the letter of the law, is something that he had zeal for. He learned that from a very early age, and he says more than once that the law is good. Probably his biggest fear with these disciples were that they were going out and preaching a message that was antithetical to Judaism, and that they were trying to circumvent the law. Well, now this would have been seen as heresy to him, so this just adds another layer. They're heretics because what they're preaching is antithetical to Judaism, and on top of that, what we've already said before. So all these things can lead to Saul being on this mission, but I don't think it negates the fact that God used that in order to say, okay, you didn't listen to me, I told you to go disperse, so I'm just going to speed things up a little bit. You don't want to pay attention, there's going to be a consequence. That's all I have for this time, guys. Thanks for watching, and I will see you on the next one.